we should keep in mind that God did not provide the Bible in English. And technically, no English word appears in the Bible. What we have in English are translations of what God gave, but that God did not give any of the Bible in English. He gave it primarily in Hebrew, secondarily in Greek, and thirdly in Aramaic. So we have in English are merely translations of the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek text. And there's no such thing as a perfect translation, because when you do a translation, you have to make a decision. You go for accuracy. If you go for accuracy, you give up smoothness. Or if you go for smoothness, you have to give up accuracy. Now, there's two different versions of the King James only crowd. There is what I call the cultic group, where they really believe that the King James Version of 1611 simply is the only valid God-given translation in English. And again, that's the version that should be translated into foreign languages. And to use any other translation is to move into apostasy and things of that nature. And so they have the view, they won't come out and say it, but they have a high view of the verb inspiration of the English version, totally ignoring even the King James Version was renderings of what God gave in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. There's a scholarly version of the King James preference, and that's to do with those who would never agree with the cultic group that the King James Version is inspired. And what the issue between the two different King James groups is simply this: which text is the best text to use to translate the Bible from? And I might point out this is strictly a New Testament issue, because as far as the Hebrew Bible, all renderings come from the Masoretic text. But there were two classes of manuscripts. The first one is called the Textus Receptus, which is similar to the majority text. Something is the same thing, but it's not quite the same thing. And when the King James Version was translated, that's the only texts were available, the majority text and the Textus Receptus. Only after King James came out in print many years later, they found many older manuscripts, because the King James texts were from about the Middle Ages, but they found texts from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, much older, and many feel the older the manuscript, the more correct it is. Now, in the King James group, for example, the non-cultic group will say this: we do accept the same manuscripts that the King James Version used. They accept the Textus Receptus, they accept the majority text. But they will go on to say that the King James Version, while a good translation of those texts, is not the perfect translation. And they're the ones who put out the New King James Version. It uses the same text as the Old King James Version, but gives it a more correct rendering, a more correct reading. And of course, the cultic group won't even accept the New King James Version, because they are cultically connected only with 1611 King James Version and no other. So you have two different King James groups, and the cultic group I really don't respect very high, but the other group I can respect, because they're dealing with the actual Greek text. They're not trying to defend the English text, but the Greek text behind the King James and New King James. From my perspective, I believe the older the manuscript would be more accurate to the original writings. So I prefer what I call the critical text. But I might point out, whether they use the critical text or the Textus Receptus or majority text, no major doctrine is denied. No major doctrine is not taught. It may not be taught in exactly the same verses, but it's all taught in the overall New Testament. And so every major doctrine would be validated whether they use no matter what manuscript they use. But however, in dealing with traditions as a whole, what we have to deal with is what does the Hebrew say, what does the Aramaic say, what does the Greek say, and not what we have by tradition. And if I was to give an order of preference, I prefer accuracy to smoothness. My order of preference in renderings would be as follows. My favorite rendering is called the American Standard Version, published first in 1901. It is very close to the original Greek and Hebrew. And in fact, when I was in seminary, working with the languages. We're told not to use the ASV when we try to do translations because that is so accurate we become dependent upon it, and we should not be dependent upon any translation working with the original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. But that would be the best translation. The only downside to it is that it does use the archaic forms, doest and seest and these and thous and makest and so on, which many in modern English have trouble with, but that is still the best rendering. My second favorite, as far as accuracy, is the New American Standard Bible, NASB, and that is also very accurate, not quite as accurate as the ASV. My third favorite is the new one, ESV. I don't think it's quite as good as the NASB, but still a very good rendering. Then my fourth favorite would be the New King James, and my fifth favorite would be the traditional King James. That's the order of my preference. The NIV is actually a paraphrase, and the trouble with paraphrases, they take liberties a translation could not take. And so the NIV has taken a lot of liberties, and a lot of those liberties have been influenced by replacement theology. So I would say if you're starting to study a book for the first time, like the book of Isaiah, the book of Romans, it's all right to pick up the NIV, read through the book, and get the basic argument. When you do a serious verse-by-verse study, you will then need to look at one of those translations I had just mentioned. I like to tell people, my observation of believers who do not move from immaturity to maturity, have now moved from milk to meat, have been tested NIV positive. So read the NIV to get the basic argument, then move on to the other renderings to get for a detailed study of these translations. There's no one perfect translation, but if any of those other five I suggested will give you the right direction. Ideally, just learn Hebrew and Greek, and that will fix it, but most people do not have the time to do that. But a good rendering will answer for at least 80-90% of those questions.